Hey, what's going on everyone? I'm super excited to show you the latest handheld I have, the Anbernic Win600. And that's because for the longest time, I've been wanting to get a Windows handheld. Now, I actually did get a GPD Win 2 when it released, and here's some rather old footage of it I recorded ages ago, but it was a prototype back then, and it just didn't feel that great. So I sold it and never ended up having a Windows handheld. So like I said, I was very excited to try the Win600 out. But before I start this video, I want to thank Anbernic for sending a review unit to me. I'll be doing a lot of testing on it so you guys can see what this handheld is capable of and whether it's something that you'd be interested in purchasing. And if you're interested, do use the affiliate link down in the description below, and that way you're helping the channel out. Finally, I'll be doing lots of videos on this and other hardware, so make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell for all of my latest videos. So first things first, I thought I'd show you the box because it's quite a hefty one. You get the handheld, a 45 watt USB-C charger, and USB-C cable, a manual, and a screen protector, which I've applied already. The handheld is pretty hefty and possibly the biggest and heaviest handheld I have. I don't have a Steam Deck because it hasn't been released in Australia yet, but aside from that, it'd be bigger and heavier than all my other handhelds. It's about the same size as the Switch, but the Win600 is thicker. Also, the Switch is 390 grams while the Win600 is 490 grams. It's fine to play at a table or in bed, but if you want to use the touchscreen, the handheld can feel a bit heavy holding it one-handed, so it definitely needs resting on something. In terms of looks, it looks okay. I generally prefer more perpendicular sides like a Switch or Retroid Pocket 3, but at least the angled sides do make the handheld more comfortable to use. It's also got some really great stacked shoulder buttons. These are the more tactile type, not the clicky type. The D-pad and face buttons are fairly good, though using the D-pad can get a little bit tiring because the handheld is heavy. The analog sticks are a little too low, so if you're thinking about playing first-person shooters, it's not the most comfortable, but it is still doable. For other games that don't use the analog sticks and shoulder buttons at the same time, the analog sticks are just fine. Most of the ports are on the top, so there's a USB-A port, which is very handy, a USB-C port that supports display out, power and data. On the bottom there's a headphone jack. On the left there are volume buttons and a sleep button. On the right, a toggle between using the mouse or a gamepad, and a keyboard button that brings up an on-screen keyboard at any time, which can be really handy. There's a 6-inch 1280 by 720 LCD touchscreen. Now, I must admit my Sony Alpha 6000 camera recording the footage is not the greatest, and I feel like there's a few times where I've recorded Anbernic handhelds where the screen ends up looking a little bit uneven or spotty. I want to assure you that the screen looks fantastic in person and as good as any I've tested this year. The colors and brightness are excellent on the handheld, and you could easily play this at 25% brightness to conserve some battery. Let's talk about the processor, and the one in this handheld is the AMD Athlon 3050E. Anbernic have 3 models of the Win600 at the moment. There's the black 3020E, which has 8GB of 2400 MHz RAM and 128GB storage. The 3050E, which comes in black or white and has 8GB of 2400 MHz RAM and 256GB of storage. And they just announced a blue 3050E, which has 16GB of 3200 MHz RAM and 1TB of storage. Now, I did buy a stick of 8GB of 3200 MHz RAM, so I'll have another video testing that at some stage. The 3050E is a 2-core 4-thread CPU that boosts to 2.8 GHz. The integrated graphics on this processor is a Vega 3 that boosts to around 1 GHz. Doing a very rough comparison to the recently released Aya Neo Air, which has an AMD 5560U with a Vega 6 that boosts to 1.6 GHz, you're looking at possibly 1/3 of the GPU power for the 3050E, and as a very rough estimate, maybe 1/5 the power to a Steam Deck. What this means is that the 3050E is much more suited to indie games and older games that don't use as much GPU power, and it's all about finding games that are compatible with the 3050E. As I mentioned before, there are two processors, the 3050E at 2.8 GHz and the 3020E at 2.6 GHz. Unfortunately, I can't recommend which one to get because I've only got the 3050E for testing. Now, I did think about just going into the BIOS and reducing the boost clock to 2.6 GHz, but I'm not sure that's going to get me the same results as just having the 3020E. One of the things you'll see later during game testing is for games that require a lot of power, like say 15 watts or above, the CPU will end up throttling down to 12 watts after a couple of minutes anyway. So it could be that the 3020E can maintain 12 watts and the same performance level as the 3050E, but I'd advise on checking out some videos of the 3020E if you can. The 3050E model also has 256GB of storage, while the 3020E has 128GB. 256GB is a decent amount for an indie machine, though for Steam games, which can be very large sometimes, it can still feel a little restrictive. I was able to install a mix of 30 games on this. Do note that there isn't a TF card slot on this machine, so you can't insert a micro SD card to expand your storage, but you can open it up and upgrade the RAM and SSD if you want. The other thing I want to mention is the battery doesn't seem that great. Now, you could say that for a lot of Windows handhelds, so it's not solely an Anbernic issue. It sports two 4500 mAh batteries, and for games that require around 12 watts, I managed to get roughly around 1.5 hours. Meanwhile, for games that required 7 watts, I got around 2.5 hours. I'll do more testing on this for the review. Let's move on to some testing, and I've tested a mix of Steam games to give you an idea of what you can play on the Win600. And in future videos, I'll be looking at Xbox Game Pass, Epic Games Store, streaming options, and also emulation. This is Dirt. Now, going forward in this video, if I mention power, it'll be the CPU package power that you can see on the left hand side. This game requires around 15 watts to push 60 FPS. However, after a couple of minutes, the game will throttle down to 12 watts, which reduces the frame rate to around 45 FPS. This is Formula 1 2012 at 720p low. I'll be playing all these games at 720p, and I was surprised that many of the games that I tested did not have lower resolutions, so if you want to run games at 480p, you'll have to force this through some other way. This game did 10 watts but was averaging around 45 to 50 FPS. I'm not sure why it didn't push power higher to get 60 FPS, but it might have been bottlenecked by something. I was really surprised by Hades. This is a brand new indie game that came out last year, and it's running at 12 watts 60 FPS. Onto Half-Life 2, and this has pretty solid performance. At 720p medium settings, this ran at 10 watts at 60 FPS.
This is how it always starts. First the building, then the whole block. They have no reason to come to our place. Don't worry.
Hollow Knight requires 10 watts, and the result is a smooth 60 FPS most of the way. Horizon Chase Turbo runs superbly, requiring 9 watts for 60 FPS. By the way, an easy way to lock the frame rate to 60 FPS is to just turn the VSync on, and most games should have this option. This is Mary Skelter Nightmares. One of the main reasons I purchased a GPD Win 2 was to buy a lot of Vita ports that Steam was getting at the time. I'm a big fan of dungeon role-playing games, and I expect most of them to work well on the Win600. Here, Mary Skelter does 13 watts and played at 60 FPS. Ori and the Blind Forest was a bit of a surprise. This required 18 watts for 60 FPS, which reduced down to 12 watts and around 40 FPS after a couple of minutes. Unfortunately, there were no graphics options in the menu to adjust. Surprisingly, Rocket League is rather good. I have it on 720p low, and it's running at 12 watts 45 FPS, and this was very playable. I think you could possibly run this at its lowest settings and get an even higher frame rate. Testing another oldie now, and this is Skyrim at 720p low. The power output is 12 watts and the frame rate is around 45 FPS. It still looks pretty good at low and the game plays fine. I also tested the game at 720p high, resulting in around 24 FPS, and the game is too slow to play at these settings. I had hoped Sonic All-Stars Racing Transformed would work, but this one needs 18 watts for 60 FPS, and this quickly throttled back down to 12 watts and a lower frame rate. It's still playable, but it's way better at 60 FPS. Stardew Valley, one of my favorites, plays great here. It doesn't take much power, just 7 watts, and runs perfectly at 60 FPS. Another easy to run game, Steamworld Dig, runs at 7 watts and 60 FPS. If you're a fan of the old 8-bit and 16-bit micro machines, you should check out Toybox Turbos. This runs really well, uses 9 watts for 60 FPS. Finally, Ys Oath in Felghana, a game that I just tested on PSP and on the Retro Pocket 3. This runs very comfortably at 7 watts for 60 FPS. So as you can see, the Win600 with the 3050E and Vega 3 integrated graphics isn't going to play your entire Steam library, but there's still a lot of games that it can play. While we're talking about Steam, obviously for people who can get a Steam Deck, that seems the better value of the two. However, there are a lot of people who can't order a Steam Deck, and the Win600 is one of a few Windows handhelds that you can actually buy right now. I'll leave my final thoughts on the handheld for the review, but right now I do think this is a solid handheld with good controls, an excellent screen, 256GB of storage, and some interesting quality of life functions like the mouse, keyboard toggle, and the keyboard button. On the flip side, it is a bit heavy, and the battery in Windows handhelds in general is kinda average for decent gaming sessions. Finally, at $375 for the 3050E, it is kinda close to the Steam Deck pricing that I think is going to make people wait for the Steam Deck instead. That's going to be it for this one. If you liked the video, please leave a like and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.